They said she'd been there for hours, paws muddy, fur stiff with dried leaves and something darker. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. She just pressed her weight against the glass, as if memory itself lived behind it. This isn't just a story about a dog waiting. It's about the things we lose when we're too broken to hold on, and the quiet way love finds its way back. Through a child's touch and a breath against cold glass. Like, share, and tell us where in the world you are watching from today. The nurses said she had been there since dawn. No one knew where she'd come from, just that she hadn't moved, hadn't barked, hadn't caused a scene. A German shepherd, too thin for the season, her ribs showing beneath matted fur, crouched at the edge of the emergency entrance, facing the glass. Every so often, she'd stand and scratch at it, once, twice, then curl back into herself, as if remembering something too large for her frame to hold. I didn't notice her at first. I was too tired, too hollowed out. Hospitals do that to people. They drain you slowly, not with tubes and IVs, but with time. The kind of time that stretches between test results, between worried glances, between the beeping that never stops. I hadn't left the pediatric floor in 3 nights. I'd been sleeping upright, in the plastic recliner by my niece's crib. My sister, Rachel, was in no state to manage it. After the accident, she hadn't said much of anything. The baby Leela had survived. A miracle, they called it. But I didn't believe in miracles, only consequences. That morning, I'd finally gone down to the cafeteria. Coffee, burnt, bitter. I took it black now. I didn't remember when that started. That's when I saw her. She was sitting in the drizzle beneath a skeletal maple tree near the glass wall. The kind of posture that told you she wasn't just resting, she was waiting, watching the window with a patience that felt almost religious. Her ears twitched once when I walked past, but she didn't turn to me. I paused, holding the paper cup against my palms, unsure why my steps had slowed. The rain had begun to turn to sleet. She should have moved, wandered off, but instead, she shifted her weight forward, claws clicking against the concrete, and with a strange gentleness, lifted her paw to the glass again, a soft, deliberate scratch. Behind that window was the hallway outside the neonatal unit. I kept walking, but I looked back. Something about the way she waited didn't feel like a chance. There was no collar, no tag, just a hint of dried blood along her hind leg, barely visible under the grime. Not fresh, not fatal, the kind of wound that told a story without the words. I told myself it wasn't my business. The hospital was in a rougher part of town. Strays were common. Security would call animal control eventually. But some part of me, the part that still hadn't slept, that still heard the echo of Leela's breathing tube every time I closed my eyes, felt caught, and maybe I should have walked away instead. I returned an hour later, with a slice of toast wrapped in a paper napkin, and the dog was still there, still facing the same spot on the window, still unmoving. I crouched slowly, not too close. Her eyes flicked toward me, amber, wary, intelligent. "You don't have to eat it," I murmured. "It's just cold. You shouldn't be out here." She didn't come closer, but she didn't retreat either. She simply blinked, slow and calm, then lowered her head back to her paws, gaze returning to the same stretch of glass, toast untouched. I left it anyway. By the 3rd day, the nurses were talking. A few had tried to coax her with leftover sandwich crusts or crackers. One security guard even approached with a leash. The dog didn't bite, didn't bark, just backed away never too far and returned when the door shut. "She's guarding something," one of the aides whispered in the break room. "Maybe she lost her person. Maybe she found them," someone else said, and that line stayed with me longer than I expected. That night, after Rachel had finally fallen asleep, I stood by Leela's crib and watched the rise and fall of her chest under the oxygen monitor's glow. She had curled her tiny fingers around the edge of the knitted blanket, the one our grandmother had made. It looked like something fragile holding on to, something even more fragile, and for some reason, that image sent me back down the corridor. I pressed my palm to the glass where I had seen the dog each morning. The drizzle had turned heavier now, and fog crept up the lower panes. For a moment, I thought maybe she was gone. Then I saw her shape stir near the tree. She rose slowly, joints stiff, and walked toward the window again. Not trotting, not eager, just pulled, as if something inside her was wired to this spot. And then it happened. Her ears perked slightly. Her nose twitched once. She looked not at the window, but past it as if she could see through into the hallway. As if someone familiar had just walked by. But no one had, only silence. Only the hum of fluorescent light and the muffled shuffle of distant shoes. Still, she leaned forward and rested her forehead gently against the glass. It wasn't a gesture of desperation. It was grief, or recognition, or both, I whispered, without meaning to. Who are you waiting for? She didn't move, but when I returned upstairs, something strange had shifted in me. I couldn't name it yet, only feel it in the heaviness behind my ribs, like the ache you get when a song reminds you of someone you can't remember losing. I didn't tell Rachel about the dog. She was still too far away, emotionally. She hadn't asked about the car, about Leela's father, about anything, really. But the baby had started watching the window. Not the main one, the little one tucked in the far side of the room, overlooking the drive below. Sometimes, when I sat her upright in my lap, her eyes would wander toward it, fixate, not startled, not curious, just aware. And one evening, I don't know why I remember this more vividly than anything else, she reached out her palm and pressed it to the glass. Just like the dog, the same spot, the same gentle touch. My throat tightened, and I didn't know why. All I knew was that the next morning, when I went to check if the toast was still there, it wasn't, and the dog. She was scratching at the glass again, only this time, her head turned slowly toward me and she stayed looking. Not in the hallway, but at me. The way she looked at me that morning, it wasn't pleading. It wasn't fear. It was a memory. I didn't understand it at the time, not fully. But something about the stillness in her gaze, the slow precision with which she blinked once, then twice, told me she knew me, or thought she did, as if I reminded her of someone. Or maybe I carried some scent she couldn't name, but couldn't forget. The toast was gone, and from the damp square, where it had rested the day before, a faint, single paw print remained pressed into the thin film of frost, like a child's hand in clay. I stood there for a long moment, staring down at it, while the morning wind swept brittle leaves along the edge of the curb. She didn't move, just stayed by the window, head tilted, ears relaxed. Not aggressive, not tired, just a present. I crouched slowly, not daring to reach out. "You ate," I murmured, not expecting her to respond. "That's something." Her eyes tracked me gently, thoughtfully, and then, with that same impossible calm, she lowered her head again and returned to her vigil nose, nearly touching the glass. Body curled into the same crescent that made her look smaller than she was, smaller than what she must have endured. I returned inside with the wind still tugging at the collar of my coat. Unsure why my hands trembled as I took the elevator back to the neonatal floor. I told myself it was the caffeine, or the lack of it, or maybe the relentless pace of grief that never shouted, never banged on the door, just seeped in quietly through your bones until you forgot what stillness felt like. Rachel was asleep when I entered. A nurse was adjusting Leela's IV drip. The hum of machines was constant now, no longer a noise, I noticed, more like the breath of the building itself. Lila stirred slightly, as if she sensed something. Her fingers were always curling, always seeking to grip the corner of the blanket again, and her eyes found the window again. This time I didn't look away. There was nothing out there, of course, just clouds and a sky the color of dishwater. But I stepped closer to the glass, the way a child inches toward something half seen in a dream. And there, below near the side entrance. Just beyond the ambulance port she was still there, still watching, still waiting, the same spot, the same angle, except now. She wasn't looking at the hallway anymore. She was looking up, directly at this window. I moved instinctively, shifting Lila in my arms, so she wouldn't see, not because I feared the dog, but because I suddenly felt exposed, as if something private had been seen through. And I couldn't explain why that rattled me. That evening, I found myself drifting into the quiet corner of the lobby, where the staff sometimes left spare food on a side table. A packet of chicken bland, refrigerated, meant for someone else's shift meal. I took it and warmed it slightly in the microwave near the vending machine. Not because I was hungry. Because I knew she would be. I walked the outer path around the hospital this time. Past the loading dock. Past the row of vending machines near the staff lot. And sure enough, there she was, curled again at the window. I stopped, 6 feet from her. The chicken in the napkin is barely steaming now. I don't know what you want, I said softly, holding it out in my palm, but you shouldn't be alone in this weather. She stood, not quickly, carefully, her paws made no sound on the concrete. She approached slowly, gaze flicking between the food and my face. Still no sound, no growl, no bark. Just one tentative step and then another. She stopped with her nose just inches from my hand. Her breath was warm and faintly sour like old milk and soil and something burnt. I didn't flinch, and neither did she. She took the chicken gently, without so much as grazing my skin, and sat back down again. That was all. No gratitude, no tail wag, but also no fear. Just that same weight in her eyes, as if, by accepting the food, she was accepting something else. I just didn't know what yet. I sat on the low, concrete planter nearby, not too close. My coat clung damp against my spine. I watched her chew, slow and deliberate. She didn't scarf it. She wasn't starving in the way most strays were. She ate like a dog who had once been trained to wait for permission. Like a dog who had once belonged. "Where did you come from?" I asked aloud, not expecting an answer. "And who did you lose?" Her head turned slightly. I thought, for a heartbeat, she might come closer, as she might cross a few feet between us and place her head in my lap. But instead, she rose and walked calmly back to the glass, back to her station, and sat as though she couldn't afford more than a moment's warmth, as though she had a job to do, as though someone, somewhere, was still inside. The next morning, one of the pediatric nurses stopped me in the hallway. Her name was Michelle, short, fast-talking, always clutching 2 clipboards. "You're the one, feeding the shepherd, right?" I hesitated. "I guess so." She scratched at the window again, around 4 a.m., security's annoyed. But she paused. "The baby, your niece." When the dog showed up again, her oxygen levels stabilized for the first time all week. I blinked. "That's a coincidence." Michelle gave a one-shouldered shrug. "Maybe. But I wouldn't tell the family upstairs with the rosaries." That we both laughed, a tired sound. Not joy. Just breath trying to remember what laughter used to feel like. Later that day, as I sat beside Lila's crib, she turned her face toward the little window again, and this time, she reached tiny fingers, fumbling and unsure, lifted toward the cold glass. And for a heartbeat, she pressed her palm flat against it, just as the dog had done. My breath caught. Then she did something stranger still. She made a sound, barely a whisper, not a word, not even a coo, but a hum, soft, low, like the echo of a lullaby you didn't know you knew. And down below, the German shepherd lifted her head, not toward the door, not toward the hallway, but upward exactly where Lila sat behind the pane. And I swear, in that stillness between glass and breath and silence, something passed between them. Something not spoken, not logical, but real. Something I couldn't name, not yet. But I felt it. like the first moment a fever breaks, like something beginning by the fourth day. The hospital had started to shift around her. Some staff avoided the side doors entirely, muttering that the dog unnerved them. Others began to leave scraps of food near the landscaping stones, pretending it wasn't deliberate. One janitor claimed she hadn't moved all night, not once, even when the snow began to fall. He said he'd watched her from the smoking bench, too tired to go home after his shift, and the whole time, she kept her eyes fixed on the glass. "She's watching for someone," he said. "Someone who's not coming." But I wasn't so sure anymore. Something about the way she moved, the way her ears perked at certain footsteps but ignored others wasn't general hope. It was recognition, selective, purposeful. And when Lila touched the window again that afternoon, it was no longer a coincidence. The dog had already risen before the baby's hand met the glass, already facing upward. I'm already waiting. I didn't know what to make of that. No one did. Rachel was beginning to speak again, but only in fragments. When I mentioned the dog, her face went still, like someone remembering a name that once meant something. But she didn't respond. She just turned her gaze to the corner and asked if the snow was sticking to the roads yet. That evening, I stepped outside with a folded flannel blanket tucked beneath my coat. I didn't tell anyone. I just walked the perimeter path and found the shepherd in her usual place, a little dusting of snow clinging to the slope of her back like salt. Her fur looked dull now, more gray than black. Her ribs still showed, but her stance hadn't changed. Head high, ears at attention, still here, I said quietly, unfolding the blanket and kneeling down on the damp concrete. Just for tonight. She didn't back away. Just watched as I laid the square beside her, pressing it flat with my palms, brushing the frost away. I didn't reach for her. I just sat there. Let the wind pass. Let the silence settle. And after a while, slowly, cautiously, she stepped onto the blanket. Not fully. Just her front paws. Then she lay down again, her body half on the fabric, as if accepting only part of the comfort I offered. I stayed there with her longer than I should have. The cold bit through the sleeves of my coat. My phone buzzed in my pocket once, then went quiet. I didn't move. It felt sacred, like I was sitting beside something wounded, but holy. Not a stray, not a pet, something else. When I finally stood to leave, she didn't follow, but she watched. Her head turned slowly, eyes tracking my every step, until the building swallowed me again. Inside, Leela was awake. The nurse had propped her up in the crib with rolled towels, and she was staring not just at the window now but at the door, the hallway beyond it. Her eyes were wider than usual, not frightened, but searching. And when I stepped into the room, she looked at me, then looked beyond me. Then she made that same small sound again, the soft humming coo that wasn't quite voice, but wasn't silent either. I sat beside her and took her hand. It was warm, dry, stronger than it had been just a week ago. "You saw her again, didn't you?" I whispered. She blinked, and her fingers wrapped tightly around mine. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind turned over details. It couldn't file away the blanket, the paw print, the hum, the way the dog had stepped onto the cloth like it was something familiar. Not a luxury, not a gift, a memory, and the scent. That was what struck me later. When I'd knelt down to spread the blanket, I'd noticed it was faint but unmistakable. Beneath the wet fur and the chill, beneath the faint smell of old blood and dry grass, there was a deeper scent. Ash. Not fireplace ash. Not smoke from a stovetop or a candle. Charred wood, blackened beams, house fire. The memory of it bloomed suddenly behind my eyes. Not from this dog, but from my own past. I remembered a shed fire behind our childhood home, the one that took out my father's tools and the winter garden. I remembered the way the air had tasted after, like soot mixed with something coppery. That was the smell in her coat. I stared at the ceiling above Lila's crib and felt something shift. A memory not mine. A moment I hadn't lived but was beginning to feel. Was that where she came from? Had she come from fire? The next morning, I sat beside one of the older nurses in the hallway lounge. Ellen, I think her name was. She was the kind who had worked every shift, seen every miracle, and buried every hope that came too late. I asked, carefully, have there been any recent house fires in the area? She turned, slowly. Why? That dog outside. She smells like ash. Like something burned. Ellen sipped her tea, then nodded toward the east-facing window. There was a duplex on Ashbury Lane, 2 weeks ago. Early morning blaze. Electrical, they said. A baby died. My heart twisted. Are you sure? Pretty sure. The fire chief's nephew was one of the responders. Said they found a crib near the wall. Dog bowl in the kitchen. The family wasn't home when it started, but she stopped. Well, maybe the dog was. I sat there for a long moment. Ashbury Lane. I didn't know the house, didn't know the people, but the name pressed something hollow against my ribs. Ellen stood. They never found the dog. Neighbors said the family had one. German Shepherd mix. Real quiet. Always walking the fence line like she was on patrol. I didn't ask anything else. I couldn't. That afternoon, I went back to the window. The snow had thickened. A fresh sheet of white spread across the lawn like a shroud. And there she was, half covered now, unmoving, but her eyes still open, still waiting, still watching. I brought her a towel this time, dabbing gently at her ears, careful not to startle her. She flinched once, but didn't back away. Her fur was cold and tangled, her breath slightly labored. She was getting tired, so was I. I sat with her until the wind picked up and the snow came sideways. And when I stood, she lifted her head, just slightly, and made a low, breathless sound. Not a whimper, not a growl, just presence, like a memory being exhaled. And when I returned upstairs, Lila had fallen asleep with her hand still pressed to the glass. Palm open, fingers curled softly, as if waiting for something to press back. That morning, the snow had crusted over with ice. It made a thin, cracking sound under my boots as I stepped across the side path again, the same one I'd taken each day now. A ritual, though I hadn't admitted it aloud. A rhythm my body had started to follow without asking permission from my mind. She was there, not lying down this time. She stood, facing the glass, her silhouette sharp against the dawn. There was frost on her back, and her breath made little clouds that drifted sideways in the wind, but her eyes were tired. I knelt, placing another folded cloth on the cold pavement. I'd brought a thermos of warmed chicken broth, not much, but it was all I had from the nurse's lounge, and I figured it might be easier on her than solid food. She didn't move at first. I whispered, "It's okay." She stepped closer. Her paws cracked the ice as she walked slowly, deliberately. No limp today, but the effort showed in her legs. When she reached me, she paused and sniffed the air. Then, without looking up, she sat beside me, close, not touching. But I'm no longer afraid. I unscrewed the thermos and poured a little into the lid, setting it gently on the concrete. She lowered her head and drank. Her tongue moved slowly, methodically, like she was conserving energy. "Do you have a name?" I asked, more to the wind than to her. "Did someone ever call you home?" She looked at me then, and the weight in that glance made me stop breathing for just a second. There was something in her expression, not wildness, not confusion, something old, something she was carrying that didn't belong to her, like she was holding a memory for someone else, waiting for it to be claimed. I stared at her paws, muddy and iced, and noticed the print she'd left behind. Then I noticed something else, near the wall, where the snow was thin, and the wind had brushed it clean. There were shallow scratches in the icy dust, not deep, but deliberate. And I don't know what made me lean closer, but when I did, I saw it, a name, or the shape of one, Maggie. Drawn faintly. The letters weren't exact. The G's were crude, but it was there, scratched by paw or claw, or perhaps just the unconscious movement of a dog who had once heard that name called. Again and again, across a yard, or from a porch, or in the panic of fire ELIGHT. My chest tightened back. Maggie, I repeated. Softly. Her ears twitched. The name passed through the air like a song someone hadn't sung in years. A note drawn out too long, nearly breaking. She didn't move. But she didn't look away. Something had settled. Later that day, I brought the name up to Michelle, the nurse on rotation. She didn't know any recent admissions tied to it, but promised to ask around. Maybe she was brought in with someone and slipped away in the chaos, she said. Or maybe she came looking for someone who never made it. That thought lingered with me. Was Maggie the dog, the soul wrapped in matted fur and stubborn loyalty, grieving someone who had died behind these walls? Or was she guarding someone who hadn't? That evening, when Rachel stirred and asked for water, I took it as a sign. She hadn't spoken more than a few words in days, and now her voice, though raspy, reached me. "You've been leaving," she said. I turned from the sink, just to get food, coffee, or you. Go to see the dog. I froze. She didn't look angry or accusatory. Just aware. How do you know? I asked. Rachel didn't answer at first. She reached slowly for the edge of the blanket and pulled it tighter around her lap. Her eyes looked dull and worn down, like glass washed too many times in the sun. "She was there," she said finally, when we pulled up. "After the crash." I blinked. "You saw her?" Rachel nodded. I thought I was hallucinating. There was blood in my eyes. Lila wasn't crying. The ambulance hadn't come yet, but she was there, by the curb. "Did she come with you?" "No," Rachel whispered. "I think she found us." A pause hung between us, thick, weighted. "She stayed," I said quietly. Rachel didn't reply. She turned her face toward the window. Lila had stirred again, and like clockwork, her little fingers stretched toward the glass. The air felt thinner in the room, like it had stopped breathing with us. I walked over and looked out, and there she was. Maggie, still, watching, but now, somehow, the name has changed. She didn't feel like a stranger anymore. She felt known, not just by me, but by the air, by the building, by the child who reached for her every afternoon with that eerie, instinctive trust. Lila made that same soft sound again, not quite a word, not quite a cry, just breathe. And Maggie stood, head up, chest forward, for the first time since I'd met her. Her tail moved, barely, a soft, slow sway, once, and then she stepped forward, pressing her nose gently to the glass. It left a print there, a smudge against the window pane, and Lila's hand met it a heartbeat later, from the inside. Two shapes, a palm, a paw, separated by less than an inch of glass, and yet joined. That night, I lay awake in the hospital cot, unable to sleep. The name rang in my ears, Maggie. It had weight, history. She'd carried it with her through the fire, through the streets, through every frostbitten hour outside these doors. And now, she had given it back in the snow, with her paws scratched into the edge of the earth like a prayer. I dreamt of her that night, in the dream. She was inside the hospital, walking beside the cribs, like she belonged. Her claws clicked softly on the linoleum, and her eyes met each child with something like reverence. But she stopped at one crib. Lila's. She sat. She didn't bark. She didn't move. She just waited, like she'd always been waiting, like she always would. The hospital began to settle into a rhythm again. Not one of healing, not yet, but of endurance. Days passed, not in hours, but in machines beeping, coffee cooling, and the slow turn of snow into slush along the curbs outside. But Maggie remained. Every morning she was there, every night, too, and always at the same spot, the pane of glass closest to Lila's crib. It didn't matter how long she sat, or how bitter the air became, or whether anyone noticed. She stayed. She had chosen her post, and Leela responded in ways too quiet to explain. It wasn't just reaching anymore. It was her breathing, her stillness, her eyes. She would turn toward the window, as if pulled, not by sound or light, but something deeper, a knowing, a rhythm that passed between her and the dog like the hush of a lullaby long forgotten. I stopped trying to rationalize it. Hospitals were filled with things we didn't understand, lives that flickered and reignited, without reason, and grief that settled into bones so softly, you didn't realize you were carrying it until it became part of your posture. That morning, when the nurse came to check Leela's vitals, she looked at the baby, then at me. "She's stronger," she said, frowning as if that confused her. "Is that surprising?" We hadn't expected progress this early. Her lungs were fragile. She hesitated, then added, "But she's holding on, like something's anchoring her here." My eyes flicked to the window. The smudge from Maggie's paw was still there. Lila reached for it again that afternoon, but this time, it was more than a gesture. She pressed her forehead softly to the glass. A single breath fogged the pain, and outside, Maggie stirred, her head tilted. Her body rose, slow but sure, and she stepped closer, placing her front paws onto the ledge of the stone planter that brought her just high enough to meet the baby's eye level. For a moment, they simply stayed like that, watching. One heartbeat, then another. Then Leela made a sound, softer than ever before. Not a cry, not a babble, just a thread of voice so quiet, it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been sitting close. It was a hum, a lullaby, or something like it. Just a few tones, barely shaped, but unmistakably hers. And Maggie responded, not with sound, but with a shift. She pressed her nose again to the glass, this time more firmly, and held it there as though trying to pass something through. Warmth, presence, protection. It felt sacred. That night, I spoke to Rachel again. She'd begun eating small bites of fruit, mostly. Her face was still pale, but there was color in her voice again. "She's better," I said, watching the monitor's quiet green rhythm. Rachel nodded. "And you think it's because of the dog?" I don't know what to think, but I know it started when Maggie showed up. Maggie. I told her about the name in the snow, about the way she waited, about the way Leela responded. Rachel didn't laugh. She didn't question. Instead, she looked at the window and said, "It doesn't feel strange to me, no. She was there when we crashed," she whispered. "I saw her through the broken window. Everything smelled like oil and burning plastic." Lila wasn't crying yet, but Maggie was standing there, still, like she'd already been waiting for us. I felt a chill pass through me, Rachel continued, her voice drifting like smoke. "I thought she was an angel, but not the kind with wings, the kind that doesn't leave." Outside, the wind had picked up again. The trees leaned into it, stripped bare, and still, Maggie stayed. The snow that night was heavier, thick flakes falling in slow spirals. I walked the path to her with another blanket, and this time, when I sat beside her, she leaned her weight gently against my leg. I didn't move, I just let it happen, and for the first time, she closed her eyes near me. I didn't sleep, it was trust. The next day, everything changed. Leela woke earlier than usual. Her fingers gripped my thumb as I held her beside the window. Her eyes were bright, alert, more focused than they'd been in days. Outside, Maggie was waiting, but this time, something was different. A woman stood nearby, wrapped in a parka, her breath visible in the air. She wasn't a hospital staff member. Her face was drawn, her hands clenched in front of her, and her eyes were fixed on Maggie with a kind of disbelief I couldn't read. I moved closer to the glass, my heart beginning to race. Maggie hadn't reacted. She stayed seated, unmoving, watching the window as she always had. But the woman stepped closer, kneeling slowly. "Do you know her?" I asked the nurse beside me. "No idea," she said, but her voice was hushed. Then the woman reached into her coat pocket and drew something out that glinted in the light. A tag. I pressed my hand to the window, as if I could push the scene into focus. And then I saw it. Maggie Ashbury Lane. The woman was crying now. Maggie finally turned, and in that moment, in that slow recognition, that long-awaited shift of her body toward someone she had once loved, I felt something break open in my chest. But Maggie didn't run to her. She didn't leap or bark or rush forward, like stories say dogs do. She just walked, calm, measured, and leaned into the woman's lap. The same way she had leaned into mine, like she had been carrying this moment for so long, it no longer needed noise. The woman clutched her, held her close, her face buried in that thick, matted fur. As the snow continued to fall around them, inside, Lila let out a breath, and then she smiled. A real, soft, exhausted smile, like something had been returned to her, like something had found its way back through the glass. And I whispered to no one. She waited. The woman's name was Evelyn. I found that out the next morning, though she'd already been there an hour before the sun rose. The nurses told me she'd sat in the snow beside Maggie for most of the night, refusing to leave. Her coat was soaked, her hair matted with flakes. But when they'd asked if she needed help, all she'd said was, "I lost her once. I'm not losing her again." She wasn't young, maybe late 50s, with soft crow's feet and hands that shook more from memory than cold. But when she looked at Maggie, something fierce stirred in her eyes, a mother's ache, or maybe something older, deeper, as though Maggie wasn't just a dog, but a memory made flesh. She was with us during the fire. Evelyn told me quietly that morning, while we stood outside with foam cups of tea. I'd left early for work, and my husband was asleep upstairs. I don't know how it started. The firefighters said faulty wiring in the walls. They told me the baby didn't make it. My granddaughter. Her voice cracked. And Maggie, she must have tried to get her out. The back door was open when they found it, but the house collapsed. They didn't find Maggie. I thought she was gone, burned or buried under the ash. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. She always guarded that baby, Evelyn whispered. From the minute we brought her home, she slept beneath the crib. Followed her to the laundry room. Sat by her high chair like it was a post. I glanced toward the hospital window. Lila was awake again, her head tilted toward the light, eyes searching gently through the glass, as if sensing something outside the frame. I hadn't told Evelyn about Lila, not yet. But when Maggie turned her head from Evelyn's lap and looked up at the window at the exact pane where Lila sat, Evelyn followed her gaze and frowned. "She's watching something. Someone," I said softly. Evelyn looked at me. I didn't explain, but later, when she rose to go, brushing the snow from her knees, gently tugging Maggie's leash, the dog didn't move. She just looked up at Evelyn with those deep, amber eyes, and stayed seated. "She's tired," Evelyn said, pulling lightly. "Come on, girl. We'll go home." Maggie didn't budge. The leash held no meaning for her. Evelyn knelt, her voice trembling. "We made it through, love. You did it. You can come home now." But Maggie turned her head not away, but toward the hospital, toward the glass, toward the child inside. That was the moment something shifted between all of us. Evelyn's expression faltered, like someone watching the end of a sentence they hadn't written. Her hand loosened its grip on the leash. "She's not ready," I said, not even sure where the words came from. "She's found someone," Evelyn murmured. "We didn't say it aloud. That it didn't make sense. That the child inside the hospital wasn't hers, couldn't be hers. That she'd come from a different home, a different family, a different tragedy. But Maggie had chosen, and Evelyn, she understood. She was never just mine, Evelyn said. She belonged wherever she was needed. She kissed Maggie's forehead once, a quiet, final gesture. Then she stood and handed me the leash. "You'll know what to do," she said, and she walked away. I stood there for a long time after she left, holding the slack leash, the cold stinging through my gloves. Maggie didn't look back. She simply returned to her spot by the glass. But now, when she sat, she leaned gently against the stone planter, as if claiming it, as if it belonged to her now, a small, silent altar. That evening, Lila was stronger. The pediatrician came in and double-checked the vitals, frowning the way doctors do when something doesn't align with their charts. "She shouldn't be this alert yet," he said. "Her lungs, I mean. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we'd expected longer." Rachel turned to me after he left, eyes wider than they'd been in days. "She's healing, yes." Rachel hesitated. "It's the dog, isn't it?" I nodded. "Her name's Maggie. Maggie," Rachel repeated, then smiled a real smile, the kind that hadn't touched her in weeks. "She won't leave the window." "She doesn't have to," Rachel whispered. "She's already inside." We didn't speak of angels. We didn't need to. The next few days moved quietly. Snow turned to slush, then froze again overnight. Maggie stayed near the building, sometimes shifting between windows if staff came too close, but always returning to Lila's view. People stopped asking questions. They just accepted her. One janitor brought her boiled eggs in the morning. A night nurse left a bowl of warm water on the step after her shift. Even security, once skeptical, started referring to her as our fourth-floor guardian. And inside, Lila thrived. The oxygen was lowered. The feeding tube was removed. She reached for me now with her full arms, her fingers opening and closing as though grasping light. But always, her gaze went to the window first. Maggie didn't bark, didn't whine, but she responded, every time, with breath on glass, with quiet vigil. One morning, I sat beside her again, leash still tucked in my coat pocket. I hadn't used it. I didn't need to. She pressed her head lightly to my leg. "I think you're choosing her," I said. "Or maybe you always were." She looked up. Her eyes were softer now, not dull, just content. I reached forward and scratched behind her ear, and this time, for the first time, she closed her eyes and leaned in, not with sorrow, but peace, like something had ended, or maybe it has begun. By the end of the week, Maggie had become something of a silent fixture, like the red maple tree near the emergency doors or the chime that rang every time a baby was born on the third floor. No one spoke of removing her anymore. They simply adjusted around her, like weather or time. She didn't make trouble, didn't beg, she just waited. But what made it remarkable, what still tugged quietly at me even as the days turned, was that she never wandered. Not once. There were no restless walks around the block. No curiosity about the ambulances or the scent of food carts wheeled through the parking lot. She didn't chase passing nurses, didn't sniff at trash bins, didn't mark the bushes like other strays might. She simply stayed, her eyes fixed on a single window, 4 floors above, the one that held Lila. "She's not like any dog I've known," Michelle said to me one evening, as we watched Maggie through the cafeteria glass. I nodded. "She has a purpose," Michelle tilted her head. "You ever think it's more than that?" "Like what?" She hesitated, then smiled sadly. "Like grief turned into muscle and fur." I didn't answer. I just looked out at Maggie, the wind catching the edges of her coat, and thought, maybe grief is loyalty that outlived its shape. Maybe Maggie is what love looks like when it refuses to stop waiting. Inside, Lila was growing stronger by the day. She had begun sitting up for short stretches, her head no longer wobbling quite so much, her fingers always twitching like she was trying to grasp something invisible. She smiled now, not often, not wildly, but at quiet things. Light on the ceiling. My hand is near hers, and the sound of distant footsteps in the hallway. But most of all, she smiled at the window, especially when Maggie was there, and Maggie always was. Every morning, I helped prop her on my lap and lift the blinds just slightly, and every morning. Lila's expression shifted the moment she saw the dark silhouette below. The connection between them wasn't sharp or dramatic. It was quiet, patient, like a string pulled gently across time. They never touched. But they didn't need to. I still hadn't explained it to Rachel. Not fully. But she didn't press. She simply watched. And occasionally, when she thought I wasn't looking, she'd whisper Maggie's name like it was a prayer wrapped in threadbare hope. One afternoon, just before visiting hours ended, I noticed something odd. Maggie wasn't at the window. The blanket I'd left her there was undisturbed, lightly dusted with snow. But the space beside it was empty. My breath caught. I stepped away from Leela's crib and hurried to the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. Out the rear doors, across the lot, past the salt-streaked sidewalk. Nothing. I turned the corner toward the emergency wing. Still nothing. Then I heard it. A soft whine, barely audible. It came from the narrow corridor behind the loading dock. A place where deliveries came in, and where most people didn't linger, unless they had to. I followed the sound, my boots skidding slightly on the slush. And there she was. Maggie stood in the shadows, her head low, one paw lifted slightly. She wasn't limping, exactly, but her weight shifted awkwardly, like she'd stepped wrong or slipped. I crouched instinctively. Hey, girl, what happened? She didn't run. She didn't flinch, but her eyes looked different. Not panicked, but clouded, distant. I inched forward slowly, reaching into my pocket for a biscuit I'd taken from the nurse's lounge. She didn't take it, just watched, still and heavy. When I reached her, I saw it, a shard of glass wedged just beneath her front pad, small, nearly invisible beneath the frost, but enough to cause her pain. I didn't hesitate. I unwrapped the flannel I kept folded in my coat pocket and gently placed it beneath her paw, then knelt to inspect the wound. "It's okay," I whispered. "I've got you." She let me. That was what struck me most. She let me touch her. Cleaned the cut with the saline I'd brought for Leela's skin. Wrapped the paw gently with the gauze from the emergency kit the hospital kept by the outdoor benches. She didn't pull away, didn't resist. She just watched me. Eyes steady, quiet, like she'd decided in whatever way dogs do that I could be trusted with this. And maybe, without saying it, she knew I wouldn't take her away. After I'd finished, I helped her to her feet. She tested the paw, wincing slightly, but didn't fall. I folded the blanket back into my coat and walked with her, slowly, along the side of the building, back toward the window. She returned to her place and lay down again in the same posture as always, though now her breathing was slower, deeper. Inside, Lila was waiting. She tapped the glass softly when Maggie returned. Once, twice, and then she smiled again. Rachel was holding her this time. Her face softened when she saw the baby's reaction. She knew. She whispered. I looked at her. She knew Maggie was gone. I didn't respond, but I believed her. Later that evening, I wrote down everything, not just for me, for Lila, for Rachel, for whoever needed to understand that some things don't happen by coincidence. I described Maggie's arrival, her waiting, her refusal to leave, the hum Leela made the window, the name in the snow, the broken leash, the fact that Maggie had walked through fire and grief and cold and still chosen to stay. She wasn't just a stray dot. She was a story that refused to be forgotten. That night, as I passed through the corridor one last time before heading home, I looked out through the glass again. Maggie was asleep. Finally, her body curled close to the planter, the wrapped paw tucked beneath her chest. Snow drifted down gently, catching on the soft rise and fall of her breath. I pressed my hand to the glass, and in the faint reflection, I saw Leela's hand rise to mirroring mine. 2 hands, a paw, 3 lives that had no business knowing each other. And yet here we were, bound by something wordless, something real, something like healing. The paper came on a Tuesday, a simple form, folded twice, clipped to the edge of a metal clipboard, and left for me at the nurse's station. A sticky note in Michelle's handwriting sat on top. Thought you should see this first. I didn't open it right away. My hands were still half numb from carrying Lila in the morning light. Cradled close in the blanket Rachel had finally let me take home to wash. Her weight had changed. She felt heavier now, not in a burdensome way, but solid, present. Like a soul had anchored more deeply into her bones. She'd laughed that morning. Just once, a breathy, involuntary giggle when the sun hit her face, and I'd touched her nose with mine. It sounded like something shattering gently inside my chest, a laugh that healed, a laugh that reached back through sleepless nights and silent monitors and made it all feel possible again. But now, this paper, I opened it. Subject: unclaimed animal on hospital grounds. It was formal, stamped by city ordinance. Animal Control had filed a notice. Not a threat, not yet. Just a record. A box ticked on a form that said Maggie was technically a stray, unlicensed, unsheltered, unwanted by the city's terms. At least someone had seen her outside and submitted a report. An anonymous concern about an aggressive animal loitering near patients. I almost laughed when I read that. Aggressive. Maggie, who hadn't so much as barked at a squirrel in 10 days, was now a liability on paper. There was a line near the bottom. Claimant signature, if applicable. The implication was clear. Someone needed to take her, or she'd be taken. I stood in the hallway too long with the clipboard in hand. I could feel Rachel watching me from the doorway, though she didn't speak. She didn't need to. That afternoon, I walked out to Maggie's usual spot with the clipboard under my arm. She was lying quietly again, tail twitching once when she heard my steps. Her wrapped paw rested carefully on the blanket I'd replaced the day before. "You're causing paperwork now," I said. Sitting beside her, she looked up. I held the form in front of me. "They want someone to take responsibility." The air was colder than before, dry and tight. Maggie sniffed once at the form, then looked back, at the window at the 4th floor, where Lila had just been wheeled out of her room for her first hallway walk. I folded the paper back into thirds. "I don't think this is about ownership," I said. "I think it's about choosing, and you already have." She nudged my leg gently with her nose. Not in response, more like reassurance. A small motion, but deliberate, like saying I'm still here. I stayed with her until the sun dropped behind the roofline. Then I returned inside and handed the form back to Michelle. She didn't even glance at the signature line. She just nodded. "We'll keep it off the books." The hospital staff and the people who really mattered had already accepted that Maggie wasn't a stray anymore. She was a part of the place, a kind of quiet sentinel. Something more felt than seen. Still, the unease lingered in me, because I knew the system didn't see loyalty. It saw rules. And Maggie didn't belong to anyone in the legal sense. Not anymore. Not since the fire and the ashes and the buried leash that Evelyn had let fall from her hand. That night, as I lay half awake in the cot beside Lila's crib, I thought about permanence, about how some animals don't need fences or chains or names on papers. They just belong, because they choose to, and because someone, somewhere, needs them enough to make it true. The next day, the social worker found me during breakfast. She was kind, young, probably no older than I'd been when Rachel got pregnant. She carried a warm mug of tea and a clipboard, the universal emblem of someone about to change something. "We've been following your niece's progress," she said softly, "and we're looking ahead now, to what comes after." I nodded. "There's also," she continued, "a lot of interest in her story." "What kind of interest?" "Well, Dr. Manon mentioned the dog, the connection. A couple of the nurses posted pictures to their private pages. Nothing inappropriate, but it's gotten attention. People are asking about the dog." I swallowed. "What kind of people?" "Journalists, shelter staff, even a therapy animal group from the city. They're wondering if the dog can be placed, adopted." "She's not a commodity." "I know," the woman said gently, "but she's outside in freezing weather. and we do have to consider her welfare." Her words were kind, but I heard the undercurrent beneath them. Someone would come, eventually. Someone would take Maggie, unless someone else claimed her, after she left. I stood for a long time at the window in the hallway, the one that overlooked the planter, where Maggie always lay. She wasn't there. Panic leaped up in my throat before I could reason it down. I ran to the stairwell and took the steps in a rush, out the side entrance, past the crates of salt and the crumbling cement ledge. Then I saw her. She wasn't far, just under the overhang where the benches were. A nurse sat nearby, hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup, and Maggie lay at her feet, curled into herself, eyes closed. "Is she okay?" I asked, breathless. The nurse nodded. "She got a cold, so I brought her here. The wind's easier under the awning." I sat down across from them. Maggie opened her eyes, blinking slowly. Her ears twitched at the sound of my voice. I reached out and let my hand rest gently on the thick ruff of fur near her shoulder. "You're not going anywhere," I whispered. "Not unless you say so." Her tail thumped once. A quiet agreement. That night, Rachel asked me what was wrong. "You're quieter than usual," she said. "They want to adopt Maggie out, or relocate her, or something." Rachel frowned. "And what do you want?" "I want her to stay, but I don't think she's mine to keep." Rachel looked at Leela, sleeping now, one hand curled against her cheek like a feather, then back at me. "She already belongs to her." We sat in silence for a long time, and then, without deciding to, I stood and walked down to the main desk. Michelle saw me coming and handed me the clipboard again. "WORDLESSLY. Dot." I picked up the pen, and I signed the line, "Not to own Maggie. Dot. Not to take her. Just to say, she stays. And if anyone came looking, I would be the one to answer. The one to say she was no longer a question, but an answer." A week passed. Not a single soul came to take her. The form had done its job, not because it changed anything about Maggie, but because it drew a line in the snow and said, "Someone chose her. Someone sees her now." And the world, strangely, respected that. No more notices. No more anonymous complaints. Just the quiet rhythm of something ancient and beautiful. A dog waiting beneath a window, and a baby growing stronger every time she saw her. It was strange how Maggie had become part of the architecture, part of the very pulse of the place. I noticed it in the way people's footsteps slowed as they passed her, in the way the receptionists now left bowls of water tucked neatly beside the stone planter, each one labeled with her name in faded marker, in the way the night guard started his shift by nodding once in her direction, as if saluting something noble. But what I noticed most was how Maggie herself began to change. It wasn't dramatic. There was no transformation in the cinematic sense, no tail wagging wildly, no sudden playfulness. She didn't become the kind of dog who chased tennis balls or rolled in fresh snow. But she began to look lighter. Her eyes were still watchful, but not wary. Her posture was still strong, but not stiff. The deep furrow of worry that had lived across her shoulders, visible even beneath her thick coat, had started to ease. She moved with intention still, but now with rest between the movements. Peace nestled inside her bones like a small, glowing ember. And inside, Lila bloomed as she was vocal now, not with words, but with presence. Little sounds, clicks, drawn-out vowels that lifted whenever she was placed near the window. Her fingers curled and uncurled with purpose. She held her own bottle for the first time. She cried less, smiled more. Every morning, Rachel would hum as she bathed her, as she brushed the tiny patches of hair that were finally coming in. "I think she's remembering something," she said one morning. Not like memory, but like a story being told back to her. I didn't tell her how often I felt the same. How sometimes, when I stood outside beside Maggie in the cold silence before sunrise, I felt like I was part of something repeating, a pattern older than us both, a second chance humming softly through time. But not everything was still. Change, even in a story like this, comes quietly first. It arrives not with thunder, but with paper. And one morning, the pediatrician took me aside. "She's ready," he said. "Your niece. Her lungs have stabilized. Her vitals are consistent. She's feeding well. We're looking at discharge in 3 days." I should have smiled. I should have celebrated. Instead, my breath hitched. 3 days. After everything, the nights beside the crib, the fogged glass, the soundless touch between baby and dog, it would end with a door opening. Just like that. And what would Maggie do? That night, I sat beside her longer than usual. She was lying near the wall, paw curled beneath her chest, chin resting against the concrete. The snow had melted in uneven patches, leaving puddles beneath the bench legs and salt lines along the curb. "They say, we're going home," I said. She didn't move. "They say, Lila's ready." Her ear twitched. "She won't be able to see you from there. Not like this." I wasn't sure what I expected, for her to get up, or growl, or nudge me toward some unseen resolution. But Maggie didn't stir. She just blinked calmly, as if she had known all along, as if she'd been preparing for it, and for the first time, something selfish bloomed inside me, and a sudden need to keep her with us. Not just as a memory or a shadow behind glass, but real, at our feet, at the edge of the crib, by the door, when morning came. "She'll miss you," I said. Still no response, but when I leaned closer, she did something she hadn't done before. She reached forward slowly, gently, and placed her paw over the toe of my boot. Her bandage had been off for days now, the cut long healed, but the gesture still felt like trust, not loyalty, not need, just presence. She was telling me, "It's okay." The day of discharge came quietly. Rachel held Lila in her arms as we walked through the corridors. The staff gathered softly near the nurse's station, watching without applause, without fanfare, just quiet nods and gentle smiles. We took the elevator down. Maggie wasn't outside, not at her usual post, not near the planter. My heart dropped. I half ran to the bench area near the emergency wing, but it was empty. The space beside the window was just space. No fur, no shadow, only cold concrete and the faint trace of a paw print in a drying patch of slush. I turned around and walked back slowly, afraid to say what I was thinking aloud. Maybe she had left. Maybe she knew her part was done. Maybe she was never supposed to stay. We reached the car. Rachel buckled Lila into the seat, humming softly. Her voice shook. I opened the trunk to load our bags, and then I saw her in the shadow near the rear tire, lying quietly, watching Maggie. I exhaled, half laughing, half crying. "You found the car," I said. She didn't move. Rachel knelt beside her, resting her hand gently on Maggie's head. "You knew," and Maggie, soft as ever, leaned into her hand. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't goodbye. It was permission. We left the rear door open, and after a moment's pause, Maggie stepped in. Not like a dog being taken, like a guardian choosing where to go next. She lay across the floor mat, her chin resting between the two seats, her eyes flicking once toward the car seat before she closed them. Lila stared at her. Then, with a breath so soft it barely moved the air, she reached. Her hand hovered in the space between them, and Maggie lifted her paw. They didn't touch, but they didn't need to. The road home was quiet. No radio, no words, only breath and presence, and the soft rhythm of something finding its way back. Home wasn't far. A modest house at the edge of town, white with fading green shutters, and a path still half covered in ice. It had been my parents' once, then mine in paperwork only. I hadn't lived there in years. Not since everything shifted, and I'd stopped believing I'd ever need it again. But that morning, when we pulled into the driveway with Lila bundled in her car seat, and Maggie curled like a shadow behind her, it felt like the house had been waiting to. Rachel stood on the porch, holding Lila, while I unlocked the door. The old knob stuck, like it always did, and the scent of dust and cedar drifted into the cold air. I didn't bother turning on all the lights, just one lamp in the front room, its glow falling unevenly across the wood floor. I brought Lila in first, still asleep against Rachel's chest. Maggie followed on her own, no leash, no words. She walked over the threshold like it was nothing new, like this wasn't a new place but a place, remembered as though the shape of family didn't change much from one building to another. She sniffed the corners of the room once. Then I walked over to the crib I'd built in the week before, unloading second-hand wood, soft flannel lining, and an old quilt folded at the edge. She sat beside it, and stayed. That night, no one slept much. Lila stirred often, adjusting to the silence that wasn't broken by beeping monitors. Rachel kept tiptoeing down the hallway to check if the heat was too low. I lay on the couch, awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling and listening to Maggie's footsteps as she circled the crib every few hours, not restless, just routine. At one point, I heard a soft whimper. Not from Lila, from Maggie. I got up and padded barefoot to the nursery. She was lying on the floor, head resting between her paws, eyes half closed. I sat beside her. She looked at me, and there it was again, that expression I still couldn't name. Not sadness, not relief. Something in between. I know, I whispered. It's different now. She blinked. I reached out and rested, my hand on her head. You don't have to keep watching every second, but she did, because that's who she was. The next morning, the sun spilled into the front room in long gold slants. I opened the curtains and sat Lila in her chair near the window. She blinked against the light, then smiled that new, soft smile that seemed to live just for Maggie. The dog was on the rug nearby. Front paws stretched out, ears relaxed. Her gaze lifted as Lila giggled and reached for the glass. Even now, months after the hospital, she still reached for glass when she saw Maggie, as if some part of her hadn't realized the barrier was gone, as if their connection was supposed to live between thin, invisible walls. But Maggie didn't mind. She never corrected it. She just let Lila remember, in her own way. That afternoon, I found something unexpected. I was going through a drawer in the old hallway bureau, searching for baby socks, I think, or maybe extra linens, when I came across a yellowed envelope with no name. Inside, folded into thirds, was a clipping from a newspaper. Dog refuses to leave burned house. Rescue efforts complicated by animal's reluctance to abandon site. The photo was blurry, black and white, a skeletal frame of a burned home in the background, and in the foreground small, almost swallowed by shadow, a German shepherd. The date was from years ago, long before Lila was born. Before Rachel had even moved back to town. I stared at the picture for a long time. I flipped it over. No notes, no byline, but I remembered that house. It had been just off Route 16. I passed it every day during my high school years. It had stayed boarded up for a long time. It couldn't be Maggie, could it? The photo was too distant to tell, but the posture and the eyes looked the same. I didn't say anything about it. But that night, when I sat beside Maggie again and read to Lila from a book of bedtime rhymes, Maggie turned her head when I said the word home. She didn't look at the door. She looked at Lila, and I understood. Maybe she'd watched other windows before this one. Maybe other cribs. Maybe other children, whose names she hadn't been able to save. But now, she is home. Not because the roof didn't leak. Not because the food came on time. Because someone looked at her, with a kind of trust that only lives in silence. Because Lila had reached for her through glass, and Maggie had waited. Spring came late that year, but one morning in March, the first crocus bloomed near the mailbox. I was standing on the porch with coffee in hand when I saw just one bloom, purple and stubborn, pushing through last year's soil. And beside it, a single paw print. Maggie's. She'd started exploring the yard more lately, moving in slow circles, nose to the ground, never wandering too far. But every path she made, every patch of flattened grass, Every pressed mark in the mud always led back to the porch, always back to Lila. One evening, Rachel spoke softly across the kitchen table. I think she's aging faster now. I looked at Maggie lying near the crib again, her breathing slow, her eyes a little cloudier than they'd been in January. I know, I said. She waited too long in the cold. Her body's tired. Her heart isn't. Rachel smiled. No, that part's younger than all of us. We didn't talk about endings. We didn't need to, because Maggie wasn't fading. She was settling into warmth, into rhythm, into the kind of peace only earned by those who carried too much for too long and finally let it go. On the last night of spring, I awoke to silence so pure it hummed. I walked down the hall and stood at the nursery door. Leela was asleep, one hand coiled beneath her cheek, the other resting against the edge of the crib, and Maggie lay beside her, breathing steady, her body curved like a question answered. I watched them both, the child who had reached through the glass, and the dog who had waited on the other side, and I whispered into the stillness, "We're all home now." Then I closed the door. Where the light landed, they slept together.